I understood yesterday that um, civil society members are not going to be allowed in today. So,
When I was coming in, some people from Fredericksburg
yeah,
pulled out of line.
yeah.
Some of my silence got pulled out of line. So they've decided who the troublemakers are. So we shall see what happens. I'm going to go check it out.
Okay,
Um,
okay.
Good morning, Ambassador Lumumba. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
You're welcome.
I realize you haven't, is it true you haven't slept?
Yes, we just finished about 40 minutes ago. We had a long session on one of the tracks of the negotiations. The long-term cooperative actions has been going on almost all night long because there are difficulties with regard to how we are addressing the issues. Basically, we ended up concluding the session with bracketing the entire document, which will be presented to the formal opening of the high segment this morning at 10 o'clock.
Bracketed the entire text.
We are divided, and I think the unfortunate situation is that the gaps between developing countries and developed countries um, seems to be very difficult to bridge at this moment because developed countries have decided to walk out of their obligations and want to shift those obligations. So that's creating massive rift between developed countries and developing countries.
You have been very clear about many things, but the two things that I want to bring out now are what 2% means in Africa. That when we talk about temperature rising, sorry, by 2 degrees in Africa, that would be 3 to 3.5 degrees, which would translate into the deaths of tens of millions of people. You've also been very clear about the level of financing that's on the table. You described the $10 billion on offer, $1 million a year, as being not enough money to buy the coffins to bury us. Yet yesterday, Meles Zenawi went was in Paris and he agreed to a deal saying that it was on behalf of Africa that agreed to the 2% degree increase in temperatures and agreed to that $10 billion a year. So I think everybody is very curious to hear your reaction.
Well, my reaction is a simple one. Meles Zenawi, the Prime Minister, like many African leaders, has not done the independent analysis to know really what does 2 degrees Celsius. One of the critical problems with regard to climate change, particularly in Africa, is that many of our leaders entered this dialogue with European Union and European leaders without really doing their own independent research to ascertain for themselves whether that's something good for Africa or not. And this has been a classical situation in Africa in many situations, in many other cases. So that's one. The question of production of knowledge, consumption of knowledge, okay, in general. But at the heart of this problem is the fact that the center of research and knowledge selects what it thinks is feasible and guarantees its economic supremacy. This is what is happening. So he erred on 3 counts: not doing the work necessary to make that policy decision. Second, not consulting those Africans who voice their concerns about what's happening. And the third one, not looking at the holistic approach to the question of climate change. Because one of the problems, one of the approaches.
One second. Brooke, can you pass me a little bit of cement? It's just quieting me down. I know you speak in a very orderly way, so we're on the
No, no. Okay. So what I was saying, one of the problems of, he has taken a narrow approach, basically the so-called fast track approach, which centers around what happens in the next 3 years rather than going deep into the fundamentals. Climate change represents the most dangerous and the gravest risk we have. You cannot deal with it from a narrow perspective. You have to really look at the fundamentals. You have to look at its implications in their totality, rather than a narrow approach.
So what can you do now within the G77? Does this close down options for you in the negotiations?
I don't think so at all. On the contrary, it actually enriches and enables us to focus the debate on what is critical. As you know, I have been speaking to many African leaders, among them Bishop Desmond Tutu, who had the humility to say, I never thought this could happen this day in the world. So to that extent, I do believe that there is more than an opportunity to persuade him to step back and rethink and reflect deeply on these issues and the policies he has accepted, or the wisdom he accepted.
There's a huge amount of pressure to seal the deal, as you know, seal the deal, and there are all these NGOs who have the campaign tick, tick, tick. There seems to be less talk about what is in that deal. It's the momentum towards the deal. So I'm wondering how you feel about delaying at this point.
My perspective is a simple one. We cannot allow a situation where, I have said, and most African leaders who spoke publicly said very clearly, there must be an equitable and just deal. If we do not have an equitable and just deal, we're simply furthering the imbalances, and we are building on the imbalances that we are living under. And that for Africa definitely is not acceptable. So seal the deal would work only if the deal is just, if the deal is equitable. Otherwise, it's really hollow, because a deal that does not address the historical responsibilities of the world, that does not give equity in sharing the atmospheric space, that does not provide developing countries with the finance necessary in order to mitigate and adapt against the climate change. A deal that does not provide technology transfer is not a deal that's worth sealing. It is a deal that must be rejected.
Today is the 16th. There's a big protest planned. Civil society marching to the Bella Center, and many people talking about walking out of the Bella Center to join them because they feel that there isn't a just deal that is on the table here, and they'd rather have no deal than a bad deal. Does that kind of pressure from the streets help you in your negotiating work? Does it matter? Is it irrelevant?
I think civil society has historically played a very important role in bringing, not only highlighting the issues of justice, but literally making sure that the executive branches of their governments do not do the wrong thing. I commend them for their role. I have called upon civil society and ordinary people to make the right choices, because at the end of the day, governments act on behalf of their people. The civil society is that grassroots. Not listening to civil society is basically abusing democratic tradition. Democracy is about, reflecting the concerns of the society. And I think this is true in all aspects of the world. Whenever there was a civil society collapse or absence, there have been gross violations of human rights, fundamental rights, and that's the history of 21st century. To that extent, I do believe that civil society must continue its effort in order to persuade our politicians, our political leaders, to do the right thing.
Has anybody asked you if you'll come out and address the crowd today?
Well, for the last 18 hours, really, I have been out of circulation and not having even been contacting anyone. So to that extent, I haven't even read my emails or listened to my voicemails. But definitely, if I had the opportunity, like in Bangkok, I did address civil society. I'm forever grateful to civil society, not only during the climate change discussions and negotiations. I come from southern Sudan, as you might know, and in southern Sudan, during the years of the civil wars, I saw how civil society supported southern Sudanese by providing aid, all sort of help. So just on that count alone, I would be very proud to join them.
I want to talk about where you come from, because as these negotiations have gotten uglier and dirtier, your voice has in some ways become more isolated because other voices have gone silent, and there's been all kinds of pressure placed on developing country governments. We saw what has just happened with Ethiopia. So you are clearly the loudest and strongest voice now, speaking for the developing world. And one way that some right-wing newspapers have responded to this have been to go after you for being from Sudan, saying, who is he to lecture us about coffins and human rights? How do you respond to this particular line of criticism of you?
Well, I would say that's simply patronizing. The West doesn't understand that in all dictatorships and in all different parts of Africa, there have been people who have struggled for their freedoms and their rights. This is a very fundamental issue that they need to understand. I'm a member of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, a member of its National Liberation Council. And from my teens, I've been a committed Southern Sudanese who have fought against all non-democratic traditions. So I think that's simply bragging from their side.
Bragging? Yes. I've been thinking about this accusation in the context of these negotiations and how we should describe the kind of calculations that are being made here that consciously sacrifice the lives of millions of people. I wonder whether we're using words that are strong enough to describe that. I printed out the UN genocide definition, and it's about acts that lead to the disappearance of a people, in whole or in part. And here we are talking about the disappearance of countries. What do you think of this in a human rights context?
Let me put it this way, and this is what I said before. I said 2 degrees Celsius is certain death for Africa. If, and I hope this really doesn't happen, if the world signed to a 2 degrees Celsius and condemns Africa to devastation and disasters, and condemns small island states to the same future, then climate change has been turned into climate fascism. It's as simple as that. It's a murderous act, calculated one, in pursuit of profit, in pursuit of economic dominance, in literally pursuit of a new resource, the atmospheric space.
Is this the final colonial frontier?
I wouldn't call it the colonial frontier, because this is way well above that. I think this is definitely a much vicious manifestation of the ills of self-centerism.
Self-centerism?
The West decides that the only thing that matters is it's herself, and that's it. And I think this is really, and perhaps is a build-up of all these years of so-called selfish genes culture. Perhaps I really cannot understand what makes somebody make such choices when it's very clear from science and from common sense that is the wrong policy, the wrong direction, the wrong strategy, and they know that it will destroy countries.
Todd Stern said that he rejected the idea of climate debt categorically because he said the United States didn't know the effects of its emissions for many years. But now we do know, and the decisions are being made with the full knowledge of the science. How do you reconcile his statement with the fact that so much evidence has been presented and they're still rejecting?
It's self-denial. My personal opinion about some of Western politicians is that they are simply climate change skepticism in action. They say one thing, they do the opposite, the exact opposite, okay, with a zeal that you can never understand. Amongst them are some intellectuals and incredibly able men and women. That a professor like Stern or Todd Stern, the negotiator, refuses that is simply unacceptable. Let me just give you a simple fact. If a rapist rapes somebody and claims that he did not know that, does that make him innocent? No. So the argument is not acceptable. What Todster need to understand and need to accept is that grave injustice has been committed. Whether intentionally or not, it has happened. And what he's being asked of is to show a sense of solidarity with an acceptance that we all belong to one human family. I think that's what he is rejecting by denying the historical debt and historical responsibility. That's one. The second side of Todd Stern's position is that he's acting as the old-fashioned, typical Occidentalist who seems to have ignored every single factor except the economics and the competitiveness of his country vis-a-vis the United States. That's the second aspect of his thinking. The third aspect in his thinking, and I think this is something, is that the last 30 years or 40 years of the dominance of neoliberal ethics have really neutralized and almost removed ethics and morality from the indicators, or at least the factors which are significant in decision making. So it's much wider perspective than simply denying of history. The last few years have been very difficult because of that. And this is one of the challenges that Obama has inherited. He's got the American sense of isolationism, of exceptionalism, a bureaucracy that is Bush incarnate, and then a notion that the only thing they are dictated is absolute supremacy as a state. When you put these factors together, you'll see what is happening. Even in the Democratic Party, you'll see that the rising stars, those who are in power, are largely Reagan Democrats. And this is part of that dilemma.
I was talking to Matthew Stillwell the other day, and he was saying that, ultimately this is the reason why there's such pressure on governments to change their positions is because there's so much money at stake. And a lot of governments don't fully understand the value of the carbon market because they haven't lived under cap and trade. And calculating the cost, the worth of carbon emissions in the future, and the trillions of dollars on the line here, he described the deal that was being offered as beads and blankets for Manhattan. And I'm wondering what you think of that.
Well, the facts are simple. This 2 degrees Celsius, among other things apart from destruction, basically allocates over 60% of the atmospheric space to 20% of the population of the world. By doing that, it equally robs and denies developing countries the opportunity to achieve economic development and industrialization, because the value of this carbon space or atmospheric space is the ability to help developing countries emit and develop and industrialize. When you take away 60% of that, you're leaving 80% of human family competing for this interest. The third element that this equally produces is a global security, insecurity that is unimaginable, because the suffering and the devastation that will result from this act of literally robbery is that you are going to create the first climate terrorist. And this is a side that it means those whose country will be aggrieved, they are not only will be destroyed, they are not only going to become migrants, etc. They will equally have an anger that can manifest itself in the form of violence and fundamentalism that you see today, okay, towards the West. These are all important factors that need to be addressed. So to that extent, Matthew is absolutely right that at the heart of the 2 degrees choice is economics. It's basically taking over these resources, reallocating them. And this is why among the most important factors in the deal that the West want to push is changing the balance of obligations between developing countries and developed countries. So they are only talking about the responsibilities of the emerging economies to reduce their emissions.
There are only 3 days left in the conference, and most people seem to agree that there isn't time to get the kind of deal that you've been advocating. If you had more time, if you had another 6 months or a year, do you believe these dynamics could change? Because I think a lot of the NGOs are telling themselves that they'll never have this much momentum again. So part of how they're rationalizing seal the deal is that they believe once Copenhagen is over, everybody goes home, and maybe we won't get anything at all.
I think they are wrong. First of all, I have absolute belief in the human capacity to overcome all difficulties, including things that are related to making the impossible materialize and become real. This is one thing. The second, the momentum it's already started. The fact that they are there is evidence that more can be achieved. The third thing that they do not want to see is that if you have a bad deal, you have equally created injustice that is not acceptable. And the final issue around an unjust deal, apart from all these things, is simply you are saying the order of the world must remain the same. So these are critical issues that I think civil society need to say we have a historical role to play, and it's a difficult one, but it's worth committing to.
Do you see anything positive that's come out of these negotiations in terms of public understanding of climate change as a justice issue, and these issues of climate debt being put on the agenda as never before?
I think one of the most important things that happened in Copenhagen is the fact that now the world is aware of the simple fact that we are going to commit one of the most serious mistakes in human history. I think people now know this. Even conventional media has started to rethink its main assumptions, because I do believe that however they might think about it, at the end of the day all the journalists, the editors, etc., know that this is not the kind of a mistake they can allow to happen and live with themselves.
I want to ask you one last question, and if you don't want to answer, it's totally fine. I started off asking you what had happened with Prime Minister Naomi yesterday, and you were very charitable in your analysis in saying that he doesn't fully understand the science. But I want to read you something that he said 3 months ago. He said, "We will use our numbers to delegitimize any agreement that is not consistent with our minimal positions. If need be, we are prepared to walk out of any negotiations that threaten to be another rape of our continent. What we are not prepared to live with is global warming above the minimal avoidable level. We will participate in the upcoming negotiations not as supplicants pleading for our case, but as negotiators defending our views and interests." So how do you go from that to what happened yesterday?
Well, his basic assumptions, his fundamentals were wrong, and that's why he defined the strategic options and the solution wrongly. It's as simple as that.
Is there anything else you want to add that I didn't ask you about?
Not this time.
Okay.
Just like no.
No, thank you.
Well, we'll do something else.